Before we begin, if you enjoy thoughtful discussions on psychology, leadership, international politics, and philosophy, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with others. Your support helps this channel reach more people and keeps these conversations alive. Now, let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today, we are going to place one of the most fascinating and perhaps unsettling scenes in international politics under our analytical microscope. Imagine a leader who appears fearless within his own country. He slams the desk, commands his aides with absolute confidence, and governs through powerful institutions that reinforce his authority. Inside that familiar environment, his influence appears unquestioned, and his ego may come to believe that it occupies the very center of the political universe. But what happens when that same leader steps onto the global stage? The atmosphere changes completely. Inside the vast halls of international summits, where competing national interests, strategic calculations, and relentless scrutiny replace domestic applause, authority can no longer be assumed. Respect is not automatic. Influence cannot simply be commanded. It must be earned. At that moment, a striking psychological contrast begins to emerge. The confident image carefully maintained at home encounters an environment that operates according to entirely different rules. The leader is confronted with the distance between the image projected domestically and the perception formed by the international community. This is far more than a question of diplomatic performance. From the perspective of psychology, it invites us to examine the relationship between power, ego, and identity. From the perspective of international relations, it raises questions about credibility, trust, and national reputation. And from the perspective of Eastern philosophy, it reflects the timeless tension between illusion and reality. Throughout today's lecture, we will explore three fundamental questions. First, why might some leaders appear dramatically different at home than they do abroad? Second, what psychological changes can occur when individuals accustomed to unquestioned authority suddenly find themselves isolated or deprived of recognition? And finally, is it possible for a person surrounded by power to recognize the limits of that power before reality forces the lesson upon them? Imagine a leader who dominates every room at home, yet when attending a major international gathering, such as a G7 or G20 summit, he finds himself in an environment where status alone guarantees nothing. Every conversation must be earned, every relationship built, and every nation's respect depends upon credibility rather than authority. Whether or not this image accurately describes any particular individual, it serves as a powerful metaphor for one of the oldest psychological patterns in history. When power becomes deeply intertwined with personal identity, external validation can become psychologically indispensable. If that validation suddenly disappears, the resulting emotional shock may be profound. Some psychologists describe similar dynamics through concepts associated with narcissistic injury, in which an individual's self-image is challenged by external reality. Political scientists may instead describe the same phenomenon in terms of declining legitimacy or weakened international influence. Eastern philosophy offers yet another perspective. In traditions that emphasize the distinction between illusion and reality, the journey toward wisdom often begins when the stories we tell ourselves collide with the world as it truly is. Genuine leadership from this perspective requires humility, self-awareness, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The broader lesson extends far beyond politics. The psychological effects of unchecked power can emerge in governments, corporations, organizations, and even families. Whenever authority exists without accountability, there's always the risk that confidence evolves into overconfidence, and certainty replaces self-reflection. History repeatedly reminds us that lasting leadership is built not only on strength, but also on humility, credibility, and the capacity to learn from criticism. Today's lecture is not intended as a judgment of any single individual. Instead, it is an exploration of the psychological consequences of power, the nature of political legitimacy, and the enduring philosophical question that has challenged humanity for centuries. Can anyone who possesses great power continue to see reality clearly? Or does power itself gradually reshape the mind that holds it? Let's begin. Part 1. What is the true nature of radioactive contamination? Why does the domestic tiger become a ghost at the international banquet? First, a diagnosis from international political psychology. Moral contamination and diplomatic isolation. In international politics, a summit banquet is never just a dining space. It operates as a ruthless stock market, where a nation's strategic interests, moral legitimacy, military capabilities, and the leader's individual political capitals are traded in real time. When a leader is thoroughly ignored in this setting, it signifies that the international community has categorized them as a toxic asset, much like criminology physically isolates serial killers or sociopaths from society. World leaders treat counterparts who have driven domestic policy failures, human rights abuses, or democratic backsliding as politically radioactive material. A single photograph, shaking hands, or sharing a laugh with such a leader poses a fatal blow to their own domestic reputation among voters. Following calculated, pragmatic assessments, foreign leaders collectively choose to render them invisible. This is precisely what international political psychology defines as strategic omission. Next, a diagnosis from criminal psychology. The limits of the domestic tiger's coercive control. Why then did this individual appear so formidable at home? In criminal psychology, a defining concept emerges when analyzing domestic abusers or leaders of insular criminal enterprises. Coercive control. Within a subordinate physical space, be it a household or a domestic regime shielded by the curtains of power, these figures rule as absolute law and deity. Armed with the power of appointment, investigative authority, and media censorship, they bind their inner circle through fear or transactional benefits, allowing them to act as a tiger in their own den. However, the moment the stage shifts to an international banquet, where domestic weapons carry no currency, their predatory leverage evaporates instantly. Foreign heads of state do not fear their investigative powers or appointment privileges. Stripped of the cloak of fear that once protected them, the leader's inner frightened child and extreme emotional vulnerability stands completely exposed. The illusion of power. What the Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches us about leaders. Introduction to the Bardo. Let's take a look at this through a deeper spiritual lens, specifically the Tibetan Book of the Dead. According to this ancient text, the exact moment we die, our physical senses fade away. We are suddenly brought face to face with the clear light of reality, a state known as the Chikai Bardo. It is pure, raw truth. But here is the catch. Those who spent their entire lives building up a massive ego and heavy karma cannot handle this blinding light. They panic, they feel terrified, and they run away from the truth. The international stage as a spiritual test. For the leader we are discussing, a grand international banquet hall is exactly like this Chikai Bardo. Back home, this leader is surrounded by sycophants who prop up the illusion of a quote-unquote great statesman. The state media manipulates the narrative to manufacture a fake ego. But on the international stage, that artificial identity completely vanishes in an instant when forced to face the raw, naked reality, where absolutely no one looks up to him. His soul experiences sheer terror. The illusion, the Maya of power he so carefully built, completely collapses. In that very moment, he becomes a living ghost, practically frozen and fossilized in the corner of the room. Today, we use the symbol of a contaminated leader to dissect the fragile psychology of power. We looked at international political psychology, which shows how anxious leaders become when they lose external trust. We explored criminal psychology, which exposes how vulnerable leaders are when they rely strictly on absolute control. And finally, we looked at Eastern wisdom, which has warned us for millennia If you cannot govern yourself, you can never truly govern the world. As the ancient Eastern classics teach us, it is far more difficult to conquer oneself than to conquer others. The real danger here isn't power itself. It is the self-deception that power breeds. The moment you lose touch with reality because you are blinded by the applause around you, you risk experiencing the deepest, darkest isolation right on the world's biggest stage. In our next video, we are going to dive even deeper. We will look at how this isolation infects collective psychology and entire national systems. We will also explore why certain societies walk straight into danger, completely deaf to the warning sirens. If you found today's lecture meaningful, please subscribe and share this video. Your support is what drives us to keep creating these deep humanities lectures. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.